Hi, I'm Tom Bradford, and today is the 20th of October. It's the People's Vote March today, and a good occasion, I think, to revisit the question of what happens to EU nationals in the UK if there is a no-deal Brexit. What we have to date is a provisional agreement on citizens' rights between the UK and the EU. This provisional agreement includes the settled status regime, and you will have no doubt read about that. So a scheme by which in domestic law, domestic UK law, settled status can be granted to EU citizens to replace their EU rights. It also provides for a transitional period, of course, which will allow free movement rights to be extended and a good deal of time for people to apply. So if we have a look at the position, if there is a deal, it's here. So you can see that Brexit will take place on the 29th of March 2019, but the transition period will last to the 31st of December 2020, and then a deadline for applications will be on the 1st of July 2021. It's only after that point there'll be a risk of overstaying, and you can see here the exclamation mark that I've put there just to highlight that risk. But there would be plenty of time for you to apply for settled status as an EU citizen in the UK. But what happens if there's no deal? If there is no deal, then the Home Office is yet to give any assurances. In fact, it's specifically avoided the question of whether the current settled status regime and the app that's being built to allow people to apply for settled status would apply to them or not. It hasn't answered that question, and when I have put it to them, to the Home Office that is, then the answer I'm getting is, well, it's all we have. So the app and the mechanism for applying for settled status is all they have, but they do not want to at the moment introduce it or make any assurances as for and say that, look, it will apply even if there's a no-deal Brexit, until there's some reciprocity from Europe. So until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed, and that includes the provisional agreement on citizens' rights. But if nothing is agreed and there's no withdrawal agreement, then there's not going to be a transitional period. If there's no transitional period, then the provisional agreement on citizens' rights doesn't technically apply, or it will not apply. And unless there is some other form of statutory measure to protect EU nationals' rights, then they will be left either in limbo or, just to show you the diagram here, they'll be left in a position where they will technically be in the UK unlawfully. Now, I say that not to raise undue alarm, because it's politically inconceivable that we would be in a position in which this would be allowed to happen. But formally speaking, if EU nationals are at that point subject to immigration control, and at the same time they have no status, they have no form of permission in domestic law to be here, then their status would be at the very least open to question. And that's where I think there would have to be some form of political protection for them, a mechanism in legislation which would either ensure that they're not subject to immigration control, or that if they are, then all the various sanctions and measures that apply to people who are in the UK either unlawfully or without permission, which basically amounts to the same thing in purely domestic law, that all of those would have to be suspended, or that there would have to be some form of grace period, or they would just unilaterally apply what's being negotiated now and just implement the settled status scheme with the associated app to allow people to apply and give them a long grace period to allow them to do that. And one assumes that the similarly sort of unimaginable consequences for UK nationals in the EU, the position in which they would be in the various countries, member states in the EU, unlawfully or with doubtful status, that would have to be avoided through legislation or through some agreement which was not contingent on the rest of the issues involved in Brexit, such as Northern Ireland and so forth. So a no deal could mean various things. It could be a simple no deal in which nothing is agreed. That would seem to be unlikely, but at the same time, the position, for example, of the UK government is that everything has to be agreed, has to be part of one overall package. So let's go to the measures that you could take as an EU national if there is a simple no deal Brexit, and what steps you could take now. Now, the fullest form of protection is to naturalise as a British citizen. I don't suggest that is either necessary or desirable in your case. Of course, naturalising as a British citizen involves important questions of our identity, and it's certainly not everyone's. It's not everyone's preference. But secondly, it may not be available as an option to everyone because of the requirements for naturalising as a British citizen. First of all, in relation to your absences, so the absences are more restrictive. But let's just quickly go to a slide here. You can see that generally 450 days is the measure, although there's different lengths of absence that can apply in a naturalisation context, but broadly works out at 90 days per year. And then I have a separate video coming up dealing with that issue in depth and which absences would count and the various excuses that you can rely on. But they're more restrictive, and you can see here, than the requirements that apply to qualify for settled status. So applying to naturalise as a British citizen would provide the fullest form of protection against the uncertainties. But for some, for example, for German citizens, they aren't necessarily allowed, by the German government of course, to apply for British citizenship. I say allowed, it's more a question of recognition. Germany currently doesn't recognise dual citizenship in respect of third country states, which the UK will be post-Brexit. So what a lot of Germans have done is they have applied to naturalise as British citizens now, pre-Brexit, so that post-Brexit that recognition by Germany will hopefully carry through. Although, again, there's no complete certainty about that, but that's the thinking behind it. But that's not the case for everyone. For example, France permits dual citizenship as a general rule. So, but it's specific to particular nationalities. The other point is whether you now have time before Brexit to actually apply. You may not have time, and that's because unless you're married as an EU national to a British citizen, you need to wait a year after securing permanent residence to then apply to naturalise as British. So there may not be enough time. So now there are ways around that. If you can establish that you acquired the right to permanent residence more than 1 year ago, for example, and your application is for permanent residence is granted, then you can apply immediately to naturalise as a British citizen. So there are ways around that dilemma and the timing issues we have now, because we're not long away from Brexit. But that is one option, which is to naturalise as a British citizen. Option 2 is to apply for settled status. Now, the reason I say this is an option now is because there's a pilot scheme that's opened. It's only for certain categories of people, for example, for those employed by education institutions which have a Tier 4 sponsor licence. But it is open to some. And so if you apply for settled status, then that will also give you some protection in that that is basically the equivalent of indefinite leave to remain in domestic UK law. Now, the odd thing about this, or the reason it represents an anomaly, is that, again, the British government's position is that there should be reciprocity with Europe first, before the scheme is finalised. And yet it's opening now, and there will be, a few hundred or a few thousand people applying during the pilot scheme before it's fully rolled out, if there's a deal, which, as I say, may not be the case. I mean, so what happens if the settled status scheme is rolled out, even if only in to a limited extent in pilot schemes, and then there's no deal? Well, all of these EU nationals who have applied under the pilot schemes will have been granted settled status or pre-settled status, and then there will be no deal. So what's their status? Well, does that carry through? Does that somehow nullify their settled status or pre-settled status on the basis there's been no reciprocity by the EU? I very, very much doubt it. So that status will be granted, and those people will have the equivalent of indefinite leave to remain, so it seems. It would be remarkable if settled status or pre-settled status was granted under these pilot schemes pre-Brexit on some form of provisional basis, pending the outcome of the negotiations with the EU. That can't be the case. It's either granted or it's not. So there is an issue, a real issue there. But it just means that if you are an EU national and you are able to apply under the pilot scheme, then that is certainly a route to securing your position, because you will have indefinite leave to remain. And then once, as I say, settled status, which is indefinite leave to remain, or pre-settled status, which gives you a guarantee that you can apply for settled status once you've accrued 5 years residence in the UK. And there you have, as far as I can see, again, full protection, or at least the fullest protection you can have, short of naturalising as a British citizen. So that's option number 2. Option number 3 is less satisfactory than the others. It's applying for permanent residence. Now, I've put the permanent residence document here. You can see it. It's a document certifying permanent residence, and that's the correct description of it, because you, as an EU national, if you have been in the UK doing a qualifying activity for 5 years, then you have acquired the right to permanent residence already. It's just that no one writes you a letter when that happens. People aren't necessarily aware that they've acquired the right, but they have, as a matter of EU law, acquired that right. So all this document does is confirm that EU right. It doesn't create it. It's not a form of permission. But nevertheless, it's a confirmation of the right. Now, that right would, upon a simple Brexit, as I say, the hardest form of Brexit, if you like, where nothing's agreed, that would effectively disappear. So confirming that right doesn't necessarily get you anywhere, does it? Well, I think it would still be helpful, and and it seems to be that there's a consensus in the legal community, or most of the legal community, about this, that it would still be better to apply for permanent residence. Now, if you look on the Home Office website now, it will tell you a different story. It will say you do not need to apply for permanent residence. But if you look on the Dutch government's website, for example, they are advising their citizens to apply for permanent residence if they're in the UK, to confirm their rights. And at one point during the UK government's negotiation, the UK government's position was, yes, it would be helpful for EU citizens to confirm their status. So there's been slightly inconsistent messaging about this, even between governments and within the UK government's articulation of their negotiating positions on these points. So there's not been consistent messaging. I don't think there's anything to be lost by it. But clearly, if you're within those lucky categories of people who can apply under the pilot schemes for settled status, then the question is, would it be redundant to apply for permanent residence? Why confirm your EU rights if you can confirm your domestic rights in UK law now, pre-Brexit? And I can see some force in that. The other point, I suppose, is that if you apply for a permanent residence, the application can take up to 6 months. But in recent experience, our applications have been taking about 3, 4, 5 weeks to be processed and to get a decision on them. But you could be in a position where you have parallel applications. So you've applied to confirm your right of permanent residence, and you've applied for settled status, and both applications are pending. And there are certain instances where it's impermissible in UK domestic law to run parallel applications. You've got to run one or the other. But here, the purpose of the applications would be to do different things. One would be to confirm your EU rights, and the other one would be to confirm your rights in UK domestic law. So I don't think there would necessarily be a problem with them. But the question is whether or not it would be redundant. It may well be redundant to apply for permanent residence if you can apply for settled status. So the key point is that if there is a deal, settled status will replace the current permanent residence status after the transition period ends. Again, if there's no Brexit, there's no withdrawal agreement, and there's no agreement on citizens' rights, there's no transitional period, then this doesn't apply. But then it seems to me, as I say, that those who will have been granted settled status under the pilot schemes would still have to be granted it. That decision would stand. It also seems to me that at that point, the existing scheme would have to be rolled out to anyone, even though there had been a no-deal Brexit, because it's the only scheme that's in place. And again, I go back to the Home Office's response to what I've put to them, and it's that it's all we have. It's the only scheme that's in place. There's no backup option if there's a no deal. So it seems to me that would have to be applied and implemented unilaterally, even if there wasn't reciprocity in respect of UK nationals in EU member states. So just to go back to settled status and pre-settled status, the residence requirements are pretty relaxed. I mean, in that you need to have 5 years continuous residence, but that continuity of that residence, so it needs to be 5 years continuous residence, that continuity is not broken by a stay out of the UK under 180 days a year. And even if you overstep that and you're away for a year, as long as it's for a good reason, such as work or study, then it's permissible. And it doesn't break continuity of leave. But even if you do break continuity of leave, you'll still be able to apply for settled status. It's just that it will switch to pre-settled status, if you like. So you'll need to apply initially for pre-settled status, and I think your application will be deemed to be an application for pre-settled status. Then after you've got your 5 years under your belt, if you want to, that is, in the UK, then you'll be able to apply for settled status. And settled status is a powerful form of status. It only lapses upon you leaving the UK for more than 5 years, or through serious criminal misconduct and the like. The last point is just where we are now, and it may well be that the likely position is that there will be a deal, or, as I say, if there's not, that this settled status scheme will be implemented in any event. There's no guarantees about that. And what you can see here is that with these two arrows, I'll just quickly zoom in here. So you can see here, just zoom in a bit more. So you can see here the various timelines. Now you can see here that there's basically an overlap between the settled status applications, which are opening now under the pilot schemes, but the scheme will only be fully open upon Brexit, and the EU applications here. So you can still make these EU applications. You can still make an application for permanent residence or for registration certificate now. So there's a period when the two schemes formally overlap. And as I say, that's where it's arguably redundant to make an application for a permanent residence, save for certain circumstances. And I'm going to produce some more material about that issue and how it could apply in particular cases. So you can see here, settled status application routes open under these pilot schemes. That's going on now. There's a transition period then to 31st of December 2020 if there is a deal, and then there's a deadline for applications on the 1st of July 2021. So the likely position, as I say, if there is a no deal Brexit, is as far as I can see, this is where we go on to my personal opinion, is that the settled status scheme would have to be implemented unilaterally in any event, because there's no backup option that the UK government has put in place, and it's inconceivable that we could be in a position where it would where EU nationals would be permitted to be in the UK unlawfully. There's over 3 million EU nationals in the UK. That could not be allowed to happen. It would be politically impossible, and there would have to be legislative protection. But on a practical level, given that the UK is unlikely to grant blanket protection to people, in other words, grant indefinite leave to a huge class of people without, say, scrutinising their conduct, whether they committed any criminal offences and that sort of thing, given they're not allowed, or they're not going to permit that approach, the only approach that would be acceptable is the one they're planning to implement if there is a deal. So that would need to go ahead, as far as I can see. That is my view. It's only one view. There will be others. And I think it's important in relation to Brexit not to engage in fear-mongering. Of course, there are ways in which you as a EU national can protect yourself, including under the settled status scheme. You can naturalise as a British citizen, apply for permanent residence to confirm your existing rights now. The official position of the UK government is that you do not need to do anything in most cases. You can just wait and apply for settled status. As far as it can be seen, that scheme would have to be introduced, although the UK government are not willing to promise that it will be. It seems to me that that would have to be introduced in any event. If you are fortunate enough to be one of those people who falls within the pilot scheme for settled status, so that you can apply now or over the coming weeks, then I would urge you to consider applying. I'm going to be producing some videos on how to apply using the app. As I understand, the Home Office has not been able to negotiate a deal with Apple to allow the app to run on Apple. It will only be running on Android. I hope, not sure that bodes well for the negotiations with the EU, but yeah, it will only work on Android. The good news is that you can use someone else's Android. It doesn't have to be your own. I've seen sort of screenshots of the app and how it works, and it looks very intuitive and easy to use. There's basically three stages. You've got to confirm your identity, and you'll be able to take pictures of your European National Identity Card or EU passport to do that. So you wouldn't have to release your actual physical passport. You can just do it through pictures. That's great. You can also confirm your residence through the government's own records. So they want to save you the inconvenience by looking at HMRC records and DWP records. What a good approach. I mean, if only that approach could have been taken with permanent residence applications as well, one might argue. But it's good that approach is being taken now. Where there are gaps or where those records will not be sufficient, you'll be able to produce other forms of evidence, and there's quite a broad discretion that the Home Office is going to exercise in your favour in terms of accepting other forms of documents. P60s from work, if you have been working, are the most obvious form. Of course, if you have those, then HMRC records should be available to the Home Office, but there's going to be quite a broad approach taken. And the third one is conduct. So there will be a criminal records check or background checks conducted by the Home Office, and only persistent or serious offending will represent a possible ground of refusal of settled status. So minor forms of offending would not. So that the Home Office is saying now. So there's those 3 steps for applying for settled status using the app, which is going to be released, and one hopes that it is as intuitive and user-friendly as they say it will be. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, do drop them in the comments below or drop me a message. My contact details are below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.